This is a presentation of the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences, Incorporated.
We'll start with a thing that we've talked about. Actually, I talked about it a little bit in our panel last year, but I think this issue, which is analog versus digital and how we feel about it, is still in a state of flux as far as the industry is concerned. The issue has not been settled, and so I want to spend a little time on that today, and we'll each talk about it and then give the people here a chance to talk about it. I sense a tendency in Los Angeles towards more and more analog in the mastering room, particularly, and less digital as a final mix format. And so I thought I'd do, before we got here, I did a little bit of research. I called my old pal Bernie Grunman of Bernie Grunman Mastering in LA, and asked him to go back and look and see what the actual situation was so that we had something specific to relate to. And 1 year ago, digital accounted for 50% of Bernie's mastering tapes, and analog accounted for the other 50%. However, this year, as of the present time, digital is accounting for only 30% of Bernie's mastering tapes, and analog accounts for now 70% of the final mix format that comes into his mastering facility. So we'll talk about it. What I'm wondering is if it's just in Los Angeles or if this tendency is more widespread. So let's have Hugh start out, and Hugh, just give us your feelings about this issue.
Right. Not used to being on this side of the microphone.
Yeah.
I'm surprised by that statement, actually, the fact of that. I wish Bob Ludwig was here or something to say.
Maybe
I mean, no. Personally, I have 9 times out of 10 mixed digitally for 10 years now, ever since the Sony 1610 format came out. I don't know, I wonder if it's trends, like it's sort of cool to have a 57 Chevy or something. People are going, okay, it's cool to go back to analog again. I like the digital format for mixing. I still constantly try analog and digital to see which is better. On one song on Sting's last album, we did actually master it from an analog tape. The other songs that we A-B'd it on, the digital to us sounded better. A lot of that music was very quiet. I think it does depend on the music, and that's usually how I tend to figure out whether I'm going to use analog or digital. The other thing that seems to me to be the decision-making thing about analog or digital is money.
Yeah, we talked about this before.
Yeah,
but how does that affect the decision?
Well, if there's no money, then you can't afford to rent
to do both.
To rent 48-track Sony digital machine.
Right.
Or the 2-track to mix on.
Yeah, and I mean, it's weird that it costs a lot more money to mix analog than digital, actually.
Yeah.
Because the tape's so much more expensive than a DAT or a video.
From my own experience, what I'm finding, just to amplify this a little bit, is as far as mixing goes, I'm still working on Michael's album. And hopefully in our last few weeks of production. But anyway, what I've found is that there's 3 songs on this album that I'm going to mix to analog, and probably the balance to digital, although I haven't really decided yet. And it's kind of a deal where I'm letting the music, and maybe this type of a project has enough of a budget so that I'm able to do that, but I'm letting the music tell me and my own instincts tell me which format
Yeah.
will sound.
Well, on Phil Collins's last album, I did the drums and bass on analog, and then the rest of it on digital. Which
How about the mix down?
The mix down was to digital, but I loved doing the drums and bass on analog, and actually because I mean the editing facilities of digital are fantastic. Sting's last record I did entirely on 48-track Sony, and the advantages were absolutely brilliant. We went in the studio with no songs, and we contrived the album together by editing, and I just couldn't have done that on an analog machine. But I still, every time I put the faders up that had the drums on it, I went, oh, no, I don't like this, I don't like this. And the two projects, big projects I've done this year, recording-wise, I've gone back to analog, multi-track, and every time I put the drum faders up, I go, I like this.
Yeah. Wonderful. Roger, what do you think?
Well, I think based on the facts that you have here, that so far this year, 30% of the mastering is digital. I think it's just because the digital albums for this year aren't done yet.
Great. Maybe so. And this is only one mastering facility, too. This is the only one.
So I have noticed that it is harder to get the instruments to blend properly when you're recording digitally. It's more work, but I think in the long run that it's worth it, because what I end up putting on the digital tape 6 months later still sounds exactly the same, and I haven't really found that in analog. I use analog as a tool, putting drums on a 16-track analog 2-inch machine and then putting it right back over to digital so the analog tape does what it does to the sound, and then store it on the digital so it stays that way. Analog does, partly because of the harmonic distortion content of the analog tape, you know, it does sweeten things up and make things blend together a little bit better than digital does, and the part that I say is harder because you have to spend more time in miking and picking the right instrument and to get acoustically in the recording environment for the instruments to do that, because the tape's not going to help you out.
Do you think if you record, say, drums on analog and then put them to digital, do they still sound analog?
Yeah, they do.
Yes,
To you?
yeah,
They do. They still sound
But it doesn't
analog.
work the other way around, I find.
No, it
No,
certainly doesn't.
Like, you know, I did a project where I wanted to replace, the whole album had drum machine on it, and I was mixing this album, and I said it's going to sound better with real drums on it, and it was on 24 tracks, so I copied it to a 32 track. Didn't want to wipe the other drums until I was sure it was going to be better, right? So I did the drums on digital, and then eventually copied them back to analog, and they still sounded digital to me.
Yes. I've used this example last year, but maybe some of these people weren't here last year. But here's how it hits me, the difference between analog and digital. And that is, the best easy to understand example is in visual. If you took a 35 millimeter camera, a motion picture camera of the best quality, and right next to it set up a video camera of the best quality, and photograph with these two cameras a scene, and then look at these two images, the motion picture film is going to have a beauty or a softness, a quality to it that is very pleasing and pleasant. And you look at the same picture that's taken with the video camera, and it has a harshness or a quality that's not entirely pleasant. To me, this is the same thing that hits me psychologically with the difference between analog and digital. And by the same token, you can take that 35 millimeter motion picture film and copy it to video, and it still looks like motion picture film. And to me, the same thing happens with analog, though it does, to my ear, it does change a little bit going to digital, but the quality or the beauty of the analog recording stays there. What do you think, Phil?
Well, I agree with the tendency. There are two tendencies for me. One is that, and Hugh and I have exchanged ideas on this, but a lot of us are recording many new artists at the moment.
Not me.
No, I know, but
One year you might. Yeah.
it's kind of an annuity what you
Yeah,
got.
but I asked him the other day, do I get a gold watch when this record's done? But it's coming, it's on the way.
You get a Learjet.
Yeah. Oh,
Well, anyhow.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I was hoping you'd get me a watch. I used to make Paul Simon albums, they used to
Yeah.
take a few hours. And, but with new talent and budgetary items being a vital issue, and just recently I went to England to do a project for Real World, which was a week of incredible artists from the smallest ethnic country in music of its type. And we were all handed a 15 IPS SR tape machine, 24 track, and said, do what you need to do. And I'll tell you, it was one of the more exciting reaffirmations that in that vein, doing this Colombian drums and a lot of stuff, and people don't realize in the Paul Simon new album, the Rhythm of the Saints, that the day we recorded this huge drum orchestra in the middle of nowhere that we found the night before, the only thing that was available to me was a little Tascam 8-track and 8 microphones that I found between Rio and this little town in Bahia, and then between that and Roy Halley's techniques and stuff and transferring it over to 24 and then 32 or 48, the ability that you have is that you can take the economics. I have a Fostex 16 track at home that we laid a whole series of vocals and acoustic stuff, and I transferred it over. And in the mixture, for me, it adds another dimension. As in your broad picture, if you have Tadeo 70 millimeter, if you've shot some of it in video 8 and some of it in 16 and 35, all of it blows up in its own particular way. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's just a new tool, and I can also make the statement, because all of you have to deal with it, is if you go to a studio and you only have X amount of dollars for X amount of time, and you stay in that domain, I tend to stay in the analog to a certain point. Ask for the gift of life, which is, will you let me put it and store it on 48 until we come to the mix, and re-budget myself so that I have those 4 or 5 weeks budgeted with the 48 track in mind, so that there is no two analog machines trying to chase each other, which is one of my favorite hate things to deal with.
Me too.
Which also costs you about 2 hours a day in rewind time.
If it works. If it works.
If it comes together.
Yeah.
What do you feel about when you hear your songs that you spend a lot of time recorded on, and then they're carted up in radio stations and going through tons of processing and re-equalized to the hilt and just tried to be the loudest things? I mean, do you take that into account when you're doing your final mix, that maybe radio stations won't have to do that, or?
Let's start with Phil.
Well, that's been for me, from the day I started in the business, which I think was 1 hour prior to Bruce with...
I wasn't even born.
No, I know. Edison was our boss.
Yeah. Right.
But I'll tell you, I spent many a sleepless day and night in this town and made friends with a lot of the station owners to come over and talk about how their quality could sound good on the air, equalized and limited, if we could have some time to play with it. The biggest problem was there was no standardization for cartridge. And I think it's a blessing in disguise that somebody has allowed CDs to be played on the air, because up until now it's been a zoo, and also the off speed, which drives me nuts. I mean, something you record in the key of A becomes A something sharp or minor. It's usually sharp. And just the groove that you spend about a year trying to get comfortable with, and you know it inside your pants where that groove is, and you hear it on the radio and you say, oh no, is my radio speeding up while I drive in my car?
Maybe you need a new battery.
You bet. No.
Yeah.
I think it would behoove all of us if there was such a little agreement between everybody that would be the most cooperative. I mean, people who engineer and produce together would give anything to make sure that both MTV and that group and the radio world would give us just the chance to let us hear it as we at least thought it could sound. That's one of the reasons I've stuck with analog. I mean, gone away from it and used DAT as a basis. That there are a lot of people have DAT machines at the stations and say, look, I'll make you a special dub if you'll just use that. I think we have to think in those terms, because this cartridge machine has to go away.
Yeah. Before we turn it over to Roger, I'll just add a little bit. The way I've always felt about this thing is that everybody's material is subject to the same conditions. I mean, broadcast is broadcast. There isn't a lot that we can do about it. So I just don't worry about it. Roger?
Well, I've been looking anxiously at all these digital storage devices that the radio stations have started using. You know, digital domain cart machine replacements are pretty good. Radio quality is basically why I listen to just WNEW or KFWB, the all news stations, because I don't have to worry about what the music sounds like. There's WGBH in Boston for I guess 10 years now, has been broadcasting F1 data by satellite for all their live classical performances. So you can pick up, if you have an F1 decoder at home, you can pick up WGBH Boston and not have to worry about any radio station processing or anything. After we got done with the Donald Fagen album in 1982, Rockline broadcast from the F1, and they got all the stations in their affiliate chain to turn off the processors. And people in their cars would pull over to the side of the road and call up the station going, wow, what is this? This stuff sounds great. And it was basically the processing that all the stations do to the music that comes out over the airways that hurts the stuff that Phil and I do in the studio. And I think because of CDs and because of the digital domain getting more into the radio stations, that there's going to at some point less and less processing is going to have to be done, and things will clear up quite a bit. But yeah, there is a problem, and I think that we do have to address that in making special mixes, if the radio station is willing to play them, where we can interpret the processing the way that we think will enhance the music as opposed to something that's detrimental to the music. And I think that needs to be looked at a little bit closer than we have been doing in the past.
I think it's a bit different in Europe too, isn't it?
Yeah, well,
Hugh is our European representative here, and thankfully he's here, and he can probably give us a little insight on European broadcast.
It's interesting to me because whenever, you know, I've been coming over to America regularly for about 10 or 12 years now, and even when I have a cheap rent-a-car, the FM radio, to me, sounds a million times better than what we have in England. And I don't know, I've never really investigated it. And even when I hear records that I've made, however many years ago, it doesn't matter, to me, they always sound better on the radio in America than they do in England.
I feel just the opposite.
I feel, yeah, I was going to say, it affects me exactly the opposite.
Even the cheapest cars sound great here. There's bass and treble, and I've got you know, I've spent thousands of pounds on the system in my car at home, and it still sounds shit. So, you know, that's my, I mean, I do think in theory, the less processing there is, the better, because yes, we do work bloody hard in the studio to make it sound how we want it to sound. To me, it's the same as mastering.
Don't you?
I hate going to a mastering lab where, I mean, I only use one guy now, but I used to go to mastering labs where it's like, oh, we've got to put a compressor on that and EQ this, and I'm going, no, I just spent days in the studio, weeks, getting it how I want it to sound. I don't want you to mess with it.
Yeah, but the thing, I agree with that. The thing that I experimented with, which I think is not unusual, is that you try to create the same impression of what it's going to be on the air. Because when MTV first went on the air, it was okay until they made their first copies of your program. And it's tough enough to get a good video sound of the record that you first made. And being strict with everybody and making sure that the last transfer was close to the original generation. Then you have to go and sit with the people in those places, because it's if you call them and say, look, I noticed the other station, our records are sounding better, they're just as anxious to know why. And I think the same is true for MTV, because it's another form of hearing our work. And if it's sad, I've taken the time to go all the way out to Long Island and shown them that there was an improper dubbing system here. And you have to be honest about it. It's not someone's fault necessarily, but if you don't watch your own product, and you'll never know what's wrong. And I know, Bruce, you've done it for years, that there are mixes that are radio mixes.
Yes.
You know, that are coming
but
from
by
that school.
By the same token, and I know this happens to you guys too. I listen to the radio, to the music stations a lot. And I'm still a record buying junkie. I go out and buy records all the time. What really bugs me is to hear a record on the radio, stop by the record store and buy the CD and get it home, and it sounds like doo-doo.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's that happens. So it's the reverse side of the coin.
Well,
And
yeah, I was thinking about some of the old Motown things. We used to drive around and figure out how the hell did they do those things, because their sound was so unique. When you heard it on a decent system in your studio, you realized there was nothing to do with anything but clever ways in which they mixed their records. And in this day and age, when the first CD stations went on, I mean, I remember driving in a Trevor Horn record came on, and I pulled to the side. I couldn't believe how good it was. And, you know, it happens with all of you guys, because I'm not a person who doesn't listen to other people's music. I tend to go buy it from just the FM drive or something like that. And it makes a huge difference if the record is representative on the air. And if you know you've got too much low end that the station's not going to be able to handle, why not make one particular pass? Because you have it nowadays, it's become trendy to do a single mix. We're back to that. So you have a chance to make that mix just for air, because you know no one's going to buy the single anyhow. Sorry.
well, maybe I can just finish by saying that it's only in the last 2 years that the national pop radio station in England, because with the BBC, has gone from AM mono to FM stereo. It's only in the last 2 years. We used to constantly do separate mono mixes just for the radio, for Radio 1.
Some of the Q
That's
Sound
how
records
far
are just
behind
that
we
way
are.
too. Thought I'd just throw that in anybody.
Does Q-Sound work in mono?
I don't think so. Any other questions? Actually, what we got a little astray there, but for good cause. Talking about digital versus analog and our feelings about it in the mastering or the final mix down stage. Question?
Yeah, I have a question. Have any of you had a chance to listen to the new data compression systems that are being used for DCC and Sony's mini disc? And do you feel that's a good direction for the industry, or that there may be some sonic compromises there, trade-offs for the digital convenience, etc.?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think it's a little too soon to really address that until the DCC becomes available, and it's sort of like the cassette was in the beginning. It's going to take a little while before we get all the things right. But the data compression scares me a little bit. But I think the effort is in the manufacturers to make a cassette that is physically exactly the same as the audio cassette, and that it will be compatible with both digital and analog. Anybody else know anything about the DCC, Roger?
I've heard Sony's compression method as far back as '82. They were doing some experimenting to broadcast over one TV channel 2 stereo full bandwidth CD quality programs, plus 4 8-bit compressed programs, plus a bunch of game downloading stuff for your computers at home. And that same scheme, or a similar scheme, then went on to be the digital encoding in 8mm videotapes. The full-size decks for 8mm video have digital audio soundtracks, and you can also use them for multiple pass, just digital background music. And I was actually pretty impressed with the quality of the compression. One thing, I don't look at it as getting into the replacement of CDs or the bandwidth of the professional stuff that we're trying to increase. But I think if you look at it as an analog cassette replacement, that the digital compression is fine. I mean, in your car or when you're jogging, you can't comprehend the dynamic range that's possible on a CD. And in your car, when you're listening to dynamic classical program material, for instance, if you have it turned up to where you can hear the soft passages, then you're going to pull over to the side of the road bleeding when the crescendos come. So car CD players, they've been putting compressors in them to put that dynamic range up to where it's usable in a car. I think particularly with the little Sony system with the little optical disc, that's what I see ultimately replacing the cassettes. I'm not sold on the...
Is that a recordable?
Yeah,
device?
recordable
Yeah.
optical disc, 90 minutes, a little 2.5-inch optical disc that fits in your pocket. And the thing that bothers me about DCC is the fact that it's still a tape medium. And I said, I talked to Rolling Stone about this a few weeks ago, and I said, I don't know anybody that has a cassette machine that hasn't eaten a tape. But I so far haven't heard of anybody whose CD player has eaten a CD. So I think a more robust for the basic consumer, throw it on the floor of your car, audio consumer, the disc is going to be more the way to go. I think that that compression, for what you're going to use it for, if you just look at it as a replacement for the cassette, it sounds fine. It sounds better than any cassette you ever heard. And if they try to tell you that this compression scheme we've come up with, even though it's only recording 4 bits of information, nobody's been able to tell the difference between this and a CD, well, we have guys that are listening all the time and can tell the difference between 20-bit billion times oversampling, dithering converters and 19-bit ones. So I don't think it's possible that they're going to come out with a 4-bit compression scheme that's going to sound as good as the high-end stuff. So if you just look at it as a cassette replacement, I think it's absolutely wonderful, and I can't wait for it.
One thing I think that's going to be an interesting implication of both those formats, whichever way it goes, is the fact that the visual information that can be encoded with the audio can be incredible, because, you know, a cassette, the biggest complaint about CDs and cassettes is the fact that you can't have any of the credits and the, you know, artwork and all this, but with this digital compression and so on, you know, you could have all sorts of pictures and have a little video screen you can plug that. Either one of those will have video ports on them, either the DCC or the mini disc equipment they're talking about will have a video port that will enable you to hook this up to a TV set. And so as far as being the wave of the future, I think whichever way it goes, it's going to be great. And think of all the equipment the manufacturers will be able to sell.
And we should get to test.
Yes,
Thanks.
right. Any other questions talking about, yeah, please. More specifically, maybe analog and digital.
I work on several reissues, and one of the struggles we have is between the older analog tapes, which have a lot of bounce and a good vibe, and they have that radio feel, and then converting to digital, and there's a kind of harshness. One is, I wonder if you have struggled with albums that you worked on originally in analogs, which went to vinyl, and hearing then CD reissues, if you hear the difference, and suggestions you have to help that process.
Well, I think, you know, very often some idiot at the record company just looks at the first tape they can find that's got the right name on it and use that, and it could have been a 3rd or 4th generation analog copy. So I think in sometimes the CD version of the original album is definitely not better quality than
So I've been pretty closely involved in a bunch of that stuff since digital started. I've been really a digital proponent since day one, when they rolled in the first 3M multi-track machine. Before that, I'd tried digital with the SoundStream machine and a few other things, and it just wasn't quite up to par. Finally, when the 3M machine came out, it was something that was a viable medium. And
Almost.
yeah, almost.
That's why they call it 2M, didn't they?
Yeah, 2M. The very first album that I did that was all digital, the Donald Fagen Nightfly album, the record company used the wrong tape to make the CDs. They used the digital tape to make the vinyl records, and they used an analog copy of that to make the CDs with. And I know that Phil's run into exactly the same thing with some of his albums. And most recently, one of the record companies, I won't mention names, but their initials I think are MCA, had changed pressing plants for CDs, so they needed to send us some new CD masters of the old Steely Dan records, and somebody called me up to compare two different manufacturers of CDs, the gold ones versus the stock ones in the store, and he said, well, you know, they sound exactly the same, and I listened to him and I said, well, gee, there's even pitch differences between these two CDs. How could that happen? It turned out that the old CDs that I had were from the original issue where we handed them the master and said, this is the master, make the CDs from those. When they changed pressing plants, they just went into the vaults and ran across the first tape, which happened to be an EQ'd copy of the original analog that had been sitting in storage for 12 years. And they used that, and the machine was playing back at the wrong speed even, so the pitch of the whole album was wrong. And things like that are still happening, where they're not the right people that are going in to get these priceless masters that you spent years and years and lots of money making, and then, you know, once it's in the vault, I guess it doesn't matter what it is. It still happens a lot, and those things need to be taken care of. There's some people still don't allow their original masters out. I put together the original Big Chill soundtrack album, and we had tapes. It took me almost a year to talk these people into using the original master tape, and they would actually fall apart. The oxide would just come off onto the pinch roller, and as the tape was playing for its very last time, to be able to get this. But it still sounded better than the EQ'd copy, the one generation further away. And but for some reason, it's really hard to talk the record companies into using the original tapes. So I don't know what to do about that still.
Well, many of you have heard a lot of albums that, well, some of them I've had worked on, and in the beginning, for instance, when The Stranger was the first commercial CD made of Billy Joel, I personally took it, I transferred it myself from the original 2-track. And it was quite unusual because it was now not EQ'd. I did not use the mastering copy. I used the original 2-track that I would have normally taken to the mastering room. Subsequently, several records came out on the rest of as the years went on, things would come out that weren't, I'm known as a bit of a pain in the ass, but I do go to make sure these things get done right. But once in a while you turn around and your record is totally different sounding, and you know that it was made from a 2-track EQ'd copy. And if it wasn't for a good critic in Boston that nailed Billy Joel and about 3 other people on the CBS label, we would never have gotten through to anybody about it. And by the way, it has not changed, because I still ask for when I did Blood on the Tracks, and there are a lot of albums that are being reborn, and unfortunately, I think it's a mistake. They don't ask the people who worked on it to even give of your time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we're still alive. They can call us up.
Some of us are. Bruce and I died, what was it, 47?
We're still trying to get it right, aren't we, Phil?
Yeah. I mean, that's the only reason.
Keep on trying, too.
I think the most important thing, and I know a friend of mine is out here, but I think if people were to there's a part of our business which needs to be reestablished, which is many of the artists that I work with, because of the famous Iron Mountain, which, if you know that story at CBS, there is this great logical mountain, and it has vaults and air conditioning and stuff, but when you get in there, if you can get in there, you may find, and still lost to this day, are all the Billy Joel original 2-tracks and all of the Paul Simon years that I spent. That's 10 years apiece with those guys. Lost, gone, never to be found. So in my sort of mania back in the 70s and 80s, I made 2-track copies, which are stored in a vault in Jersey. And that is the only reference we have to our life or to that music. And it's a drag, because some of those things, like Still Crazy, after all these years, a lot of records we did in New Orleans, we did records in Muscle Shoals that are priceless, because even though they were done on old 16-track machines and mixed to an old MCI 2-track, that was what we had. That was the baby. And given a shot, I found 5 songs in the thing that we gave to Warner Brothers just as a gift to let them use it. And all of the analog material crumbled on the tape, but I respliced everything once, set it once, and I mean, for me, that's the digital that saved my life. But I'm really upset that the people who could take a minute, because it's not dollars, and say, would you pay attention, could you help us, or...
You know, they don't know, that's the thing. I mean, when somebody goes to work gets a job in an A&R department at a record company, they should have either a book or, you know, I mean, I ring up or speak to A&R companies, they don't know what a DAT is, some of these girls, whose job it is to go and find the tape. You know, they don't know the difference between analog and digital. So I think it's, you know, the most important thing would be to educate the people who, in the record companies, who have those
for a bit of a
responsibilities.
sham, though.
Huh?
The public is paying for this by the mere fact that you see a whole Motown catalog or a whole series of jazz records. There's a whole Creed Taylor collection, which somebody said to me, have you seen the stuff you did with the Brazilian bands? Because I sort of was like the engineer for that period. I've heard some of them. I've got the Jobim album I recorded, and I've got the original 2-track. It doesn't resemble it, not even near it.
That's what I'm saying. If we educated the
You know,
people.
it's like watching an old television show. It's whoever's third generation copy out of some traditional storage method. And I'll tell you something out here, if people were to really refine that art of reprocessing this stuff, because I wouldn't mind hearing the stuff that other people made of that period, just in the form that it was approved in the control room.
The original,
If you could have that line of work, I think people would really attach
something
themselves.
kind of interesting has been happening to me in the last few years. I'm getting calls from record companies, because I keep tapes, you know, as all of us do, and I've been able to provide a couple of original tapes of stuff I did, like with Basie and Woody Herman and some of those things. But also some Oscar Peterson stuff that was reissued on CD that consequently sounds fairly decent. But any other questions? And I guess before we do that, what we can really say, I think digital has helped as far as a storage medium. I don't know if it's the ultimate storage medium, but it's certainly a bit more robust than analog tapes. So that, from that aspect, it's kind of interesting. There is a company in Los Angeles that is now specializing in optical storage of masters and so on. So maybe that has a future. Yeah.
Just a quick comment on that topic. Last night at the AES convention here, there was a workshop session on audio restoration and preservation. A lot of the stuff you guys are talking about right now was discussed by a panel of people last night about storage on analog versus digital. They have their technical committee on preservation has come up with some recommendations that they have and that several of the archives in the states here are using for what formats they recommend storage on.
What was the upshot of the discussion? Anything worthwhile?
Well, one thing that might be curious to hear is that their recommendation at this time is to store, for archiving and preservation, to store everything on analog 2-track masters, because they don't yet feel there's any digital format that they have enough confidence in that's going to be around in 10 years. You know, so, and some other, have some other recommendations, and there are some...
I'm not sure I would agree. Would anybody else agree with that on the panel here?
No, I think, you know, when you put your music or program material onto a piece of analog tape and you listen back to it, you may like the way it sounds, you may like what analog does, you may like the fact that there isn't any crunchiness at the top end or whatever you want to call it. You might prefer that, but if you had a perfect auditory memory and came back in 2 hours and listened to that same tape, it's not going to sound the same, just because of the physics involved in the way the particles behave on the piece of analog tape. It's not going to be the same anymore. They might come up with ways and coatings so that the tape doesn't fall apart after it's been in the vault for 30 years, but the sound is still going to deteriorate from what you originally put on the tape. And I think just based on that alone, that it has to be digital storage for archiving. Maybe the medium that the digital information is stored on has some problems with longevity. How long does a CD last? How long is an optical disc going to last? How long is digital longitudinal tape going to last? There might be problems with that, but as far as the information itself, the best chance of 30 years from now playing it back and having it be close to what it originally was, I think is still going to be digital. Aside from the fact that you might not like what digital does, it does less of a percentage over this 30 years.
I think their concern was less about the digital or analog process and more about what you mentioned about the tape deterioration, that if the analog tape deteriorates, they kind of know how to restore that, and if the digital tape deteriorates, I think they know how to make it come back.
That's news to us.
Yeah, so
But
I
one
want to
thing,
meet those guys outside after.
yeah, right, we'll have a little talk with them.
Do that.
But
Also that they, at least this one archive, Belfer Lab, which is up in Syracuse, I guess, they recommended storing, not doing any processing for the things that they store, that the things they archive are just as straight a transfer as they can make, and any restoration stuff that they want to do, they do later when it gets played back later on.
seems
so
to
that
me
you're not
they
screwing
need a
around
little
with the
bit of
original
input
mix.
in the creative aspect of that, as far as getting back to what the emotional musical statement of what that tape was supposed to make in the beginning, because once these copies are made and they change and so on, the music changes and the value of that music changes. That's, would seem to me to be important. Great, thank you.
There's another kind of a how long question having to do with the multi-track generation. Earlier you guys were all talking about 16-track 2-inch as a drum and bass processor and all that, and I kind of like that, and I've read your stuff on Pan about odes to your JH16 and everything. I was wondering, everybody nodded heads when you said it should be, if possible, stored on 48 or 32 as quickly as possible. Where is that? In other words, the end of the day, I mean, when do you start hearing deterioration?
Immediately. The
Yeah.
sooner, the better.
I've done, I do one analog album a year. I've done nothing but digital since 1980, except for one analog album a year, so that I know what the SRs are doing and I know what the new tape formulations are doing, so I can, have dealt with it. And every time I do one of these analog projects, I run a digital 2-track alongside, so when I'm cutting tracks, I run it onto the digital, and then I play back the analog and the digital at the same time and compare them, so I can hear what the difference is between what the analog tape is doing and what's on the digital. They're very close, except for the things you like about what analog does. When you first cut the track and you play it back 10 minutes later, it's pretty close. At the end of the evening, if you take that multi-track, put it back up and play it, already the transients are starting to go away on the piano attacks and the drum attacks and things, cymbal crashes. If you are working like a racehorse and a week later it's time to mix that tune, pretty much the things have taken a bad turn for the worse on transient attack on the piece of analog tape. And you put up the DAT or the digital 2-track and compare them, and there's a world of difference between those leading edges of the attacks of these instruments. It goes real fast. And before there was digital or anything to compare it to, we'd all sit in the studio when it was time to mix, and the artist would invariably say, I could have sworn that when we cut the tracks, they sounded ballsier than they do now.
Because they did.
Because they did.
Yeah.
Right.
Is it so much time or passes on the machine, or?
It's both.
Yeah. So just time will change it. If you don't change the temperature and just have it sitting there not moving, the little particles will migrate just from changes in the Earth's magnetic field or whatever, just time as it passes. Then it's increased by passes over the machine.
I mean, you could, we did this a long time ago. I was doing an album for Atlantic, and Tommy Dowd was kind of the broad executive guy, and we all took our little work copy tapes, the 24s, and did our sweetening with, it was one of those really interesting albums, and we all carried alignment tape. And just as a fun thing, I kept recording the 15K just to see what was happening to the tape as the weeks went by. I mean, that just in that normalcy of watching frequencies change and you know, the same burden when I say I just did a good date today and I did it on this machine. I'm not superstitious, but I will transfer from that machine that moment as quickly to the Digi. I sort of made deals with studios because somebody will come in with a Digi machine an hour later. If you can park one, you are at least transferring the moment, and also for me, it's the emotional thing that I hear off that tape, because I know even if I keep them same studio overnight and I come back in the morning, there's a definite, you're so right, Roger, because it comes from how you hear and perceive things. It's not static drugs going into kick, you know. It's pure music. It does change.
Yeah, what I do is I record like drums and percussion on my old 16 track, but the way that we're set up is the output cables, I have mic cables going from the output of the 16 track right into my Mitsubishi 32 track, and the instant that 16 track is done, it's on the 32 track. It seems to me that for the past few years in the recording industry, we've seen a lot more evolution on the technical level than on the emotional level. And to me, although it's beginning to change a little bit, but to me, highly techno music isn't soul-moving anymore. And I think that's unhealthy. Anyone can sound like anyone. And what I would like these fellows here to think about and talk about a little bit is the fact that we may not be feeding the future of music, or we may be feeding the future of music with something that's not truly music anymore. And I am happy to report, though, that at this point in time, I feel a bit of a gentle rebellion in the record industry in general against and away from drum machines, synthesizers, and thank you, and the high technology music. Now, what I'd like to find out, I'd love to know, is it just me alone that feels this? Evidently not, but or is it happening for others here as well? So let's start at the end of the table with my pal Phil.
Well, I tend to agree. I don't know what happens as the generation of instruments come and go, but it seems to me that I get involved with a lot of people who make records at home, and I have that facility too. So sometimes the limitation of what you have is what you use. But people get quite turned on by the fact that you know how to record an acoustic guitar along with a voice and with percussion that may be overdubbed. But I think a lot of people are finding the technique of using, since sounds are no longer that unique anymore, so that samples are available off the street, you can tend to make a pretty good record as an idea. But 90% of the people I'm working with, the new artist that I have out on SBK, which is available in the lobby, $9.98, he and I started out with a band because I sort of felt that would be more productive for him. And then we sort of slacked off because the band members weren't quite working and gelling. But we did end up where a lot of guide tracks were made with the bass and guitar and the keyboard being played live and the vocal live. And then we added the drums. So I think there's a tremendous feeling now that people are attaching themselves. I have 3 children of various ages, and I was so surprised that my teenage son is actually rebelling against a lot of the techno, not because of me, because kids don't follow in their father's light, because what we do is common, you know. But the musicianship that they are sentimental about is kind of the rock and roll sounds that were produced by real instruments and people. So I think there's a general movement towards it, and you know, not to belabor the point, but when a Natalie Cole's record suddenly peaks on top, it's sort of wild to hear a big band and all this stuff. You wonder if that some of the schools may even install an instrument back into the place.
Right, isn't it possible?
God forbid. Huh?
It seems that maybe it's possible that we have lost something that we consider subconsciously very precious in music by producing music with so many machines. Roger?
Well, I feel strongly toward acoustic instruments in the recording violin, played by real musicians. That's the way we tried to do all the early Steely Dan records. I did build a machine to help things out, but the criteria was to, so that you couldn't tell at all that it was a machine, and there's only one of them, and every mode of recording with the Steely Dan and Donald Fagen stuff tried not to use things like that, and only maybe use it to fix little things here and there, but basically to use real musicians. Walter Becker and I, over the last 2 years, have done 12 jazz albums of go into the studio for 2 days, record the whole album, mix the whole album in 1 day, and the record that we play to make sure that we're doing it correctly is Miles Davis' Kind of Blue. We put that up on the monitors and go, yeah, that's what we're trying to make this sound like. Then we go and start recording an album and go, well, came close, but not quite, maybe next time. And we keep trying to do this, and I think it's this live recording with minimum amount of overdubs, if any, and mixing quickly 10 tunes in 1 day, just all emotionally. You put the faders up and it feels good, and you move some of the solos around if you feel like doing it, and you print it to the 2-track, and okay, on to the next tune. And you get the album done, and when it comes out in the stores and you get the CD from the record company, you put it on and go, wow, who did that? Did I do that? It just is all emotionally involved with real musicians playing real instruments, and that's a great relief for the times when you have to go in the studio and work on something that where the artist feels like it's not going to be perfect enough unless he uses a machine, and then you have to spend years trying to figure out how to make that machine sound like a human being, when in the first place all you should have done is just call up a human being.
You?
Yeah, okay, this is a subject that I could probably talk all afternoon about, because I think in some ways it's great. I mean, I know when I was a teenager you couldn't make records at home really because there just wasn't any equipment, you know. I can remember, you know, when the TAC 4-track first came out, it was like, wow, unbelievable. Now you've got all these reverbs that you can buy for $100 and all that sort of thing. And often I'm going in the studio trying to recreate the demo that sounds fantastic, even though it might have been done on a 4-track or whatever, 8-track, 16-track at home. I think that this technology has not helped the art of songwriting. I really do agree with you on that, Bruce. And I think it is very easy for somebody to go into the store and spend $1,000 on equipment, go home and make something sound fantastic. Now, where has the art of songwriting gone to me, where somebody can come to you and play a song on a piano and it sounds fantastic with no effects or doobies all over it? And but on the other hand, I don't think you can knock the validity of certain electronic music. You know, I don't know, bands like the Human League or Depeche Mode from England. That is the sort of music that it is. I mean, I know I tend to certainly would not use drum machines if a real drummer can do the job. I mean, on certain songs with Phil Collins that we do, you want that 808 drum machine sound.
No question.
So in a way, it's sort of horses for courses.
Yeah, so...
But I think I agree with you that there is, rebellion might be too much of a strong word, but people are going back definitely to playing
gentle rebellion,
their instruments.
So I think that maybe the thing to do, and I'm trying to do it in what I'm working on, is that there's a compromise mixture of synthesizers, programmers, and musicians that works together. And having come into this industry early on, where all we did, Phil and I would be, we'd have a 3-hour record date with a band, and you walk out at the end of the record date with the tape with 4 finished songs, mixed.
Do you have any feelings about recording acoustic pianos as opposed to sampled pianos? Because as a player, I've always wanted to really play from the acoustic piano because of the way it feels and that emotional connection. But the engineers always seem to opt for the sampled pianos, and I just wondered, should we try
your engineer.
Yeah, you need a new engineer. Yeah. Well, for me, you know, I love recording the acoustic piano, but I think the music will kind of dictate what that should be. But it's real easy to hook up a piano sample and record it.
Yeah, I mean, to me,
it's lazy.
there's some great piano samples, and to me, the real advantage of electronic piano samples is stage work, for instance. I mean, it used to be hell trying to get a good sound on a real piano, or carting around a grand piano on a tour. Now you can get a pretty damn good sound through a module or you know, a Roland, whatever. That to me is the advantage of these new digital things. But I mean, I'm quite regularly asked. I'm at a studio and a young engineer comes up and says, "I've got to do a drum kit tomorrow. How am I going to do it?" You know.
Yeah, we'll talk about that on the next page here. Roger, you got anything to?
Well, I think that we're talking about the artist again, that is the most important part in making the music. You know, if you put us together in the studio and with all the equipment in the world, we could sit around, and if there was no artist writing the songs to walk in the door for us to record, we'd all be out of work. And so if playing the acoustic piano is what feels better and is the best expression for the artist, then that's our job to record that and record that expression. And it's not my place to say, well, you know, gee, it'd be easier for me to record if we just use the sample piano. Come on, use the sample piano. Just plug in a 1/4-inch jack and we're done, and we can be in our hammock in the corner and let it go. What we're going to talk about a little bit later is the lack of some of this stuff. That I would do just what Bruce said: find somebody else that'll record things the way that you want to record them.
Phil?
Well, I'll do a quick wrap on that. I spent many years with Billy Joel, and I don't think, and people still don't believe me, but every album you've ever heard, he never stood up to sing. Maybe in Innocent Man, he stood up in one thing where he did a doo-wop group, but he and the piano are totally connected. And as simple as even overdubbing his voice for a fix in the record, we would just keep the piano open and just punch in the same thing, and he played just as hard for. It's part of his whole body connection, and if you're an artist that says, I prefer to play on an acoustic, then I think I go along with you. Get rid of the engineer.
What I'd like to talk about next is, and I hope we don't offend any people here, because I guarantee on this one we're going to get some interesting comments. How does each of us here feel about the quality of the graduates coming from the recording schools? And I want to elaborate just a little bit about this, and I'll hope for a little audience participation in this, please, as well. And I'd like to ask Phil and Roger and Hugh about how are the schools doing as far as preparing students for the modern recording studio, and what does each of us feel that young people just starting in the business should know? And do each of us here even care if an applicant has been to a recording school? And also then we'll close this little part out with some little sage advice that each of us could give students interested in pursuing a career. So, Roger, why don't you start? What do you feel about recording schools?
Well, my first impression is that I don't know what they do with all of the students that graduate the recording schools. I mean, they must use them for chum or something, I guess. I don't know. There's a bunch of recording schools, and they crank out a lot of students, and there aren't that many recording studios around the country. And I don't know whether they're all going to be the upcoming artists of the future because they've got their little home recording studios, and now they've learned how to use all that equipment, and they're going to write their own songs and become big hit artists, or whether it's, you know, even the resumes I'd get across my desk are only a small portion of the number of students that they must be graduating. I have, in the last 2 years, there's a second that I've been using at Soundworks in LA named Tom Hardesty, who came from Berkeley, and he's been excellent, and he's saved my rear end a bunch of times. And it's a pleasure being able to just walk in the studio and have everything ready, especially when I just jumped off a plane from some other planet and need to start recording some completely 180-degree different type of music. And coming off the shock of all of that, it's usually 2 takes into the 3rd tune before I finally look at him and say, so are we using the 48-track digital? Did you put the right microphones on the piano for me? So it's been a real help, and it's been a lot of the stuff that he learned in school has helped this relationship. There have been times when I've had students that come out of one of the recording schools or whatever recording school, and they even had their own different terminology for things, VI indicators instead of VU meters, which
everybody knows is right.
And pars instead of mults, or things like that, where I have to stop and think, what's a par? Oh, a parallel, yes. And so that's happened a few times. So I think it, like any other schooling, it depends a lot on the individual, whether or not the school did him any good or not, or whether it was just a hole to sink his dad's money into. It's pot luck, you know. But I am really worried. When I got into the recording business, it was easier. 3 of us just built a little recording studio and started recording, you know, and that was how easy it was. And now, if I had to come up and get into the recording business now, I'd probably still be stuck at a nuclear power plant somewhere because I wouldn't be able to get a job. And it's really hard, and I am genuinely worried about all of these people and where they're going to go. And if indeed this is the recording school is the proper forum for all of this. You know, I'm not sure about that.
One thing from my own personal experience, and I'm sure you guys will enjoy this, I wish they'd just teach them how to write track sheets. Clearly and legibly.
Writing.
I end up doing my own.
Yeah.
I can't understand. You? Sorry.
I think that only half of working in a studio or on a session is the technical side of it. I don't know, maybe half, I don't know. But what I don't think you learn in recording studios is diplomacy, how you get on with the client, all those sort of things, which is, to me, even more important than the actual technology, is how you get on, how the session moves smoothly, everybody's working well.
You should have a studio psychology course.
And I think the people who come out of these schools, I'm scared of them. They probably know more than I do, technically. I know, I live in England. I work here quite a lot, but I know a lot of studios in London won't have people who come out of schools because, number one, they want to train the people up themselves. Number two, they want to have school leavers at 17, 18-year-olds where they can only pay them £40 a week. You know, when a guy comes out of college, he's like qualified, he's got all these letters and numbers behind his name, and he wants more money than they're probably paying the chief engineer at the studio. And also I know that, from working a lot at the Townhouse, for instance, in London, they definitely feel they want to train their own people up, and they don't want people to come in with other attitudes that perhaps they don't agree with. And I sort of tend to agree with that, and I agree with what Roger's saying as well. There just aren't enough jobs around.
The only thing that's kind of interesting to think about, when Phil and I started in this thing, not only were there no schools, there were no jobs.
Right.
The recording industry was dinky. I mean, it was nothing. But we got work.
Yeah.
I don't remember how we did it. Do you?
My feeling always is if you're keen, if you're that keen, I mean, this is how I got a job in a studio. There weren't that many studios in London when I started, but I knew that's what I wanted to do, and nothing else would do.
Well, yes,
and
that's
I
the key.
think anybody
That's the key.
who wants to do something hard enough will succeed at it.
Phil?
No, I have a split feeling about this because When I was 15 years old, I worked in a recording studio. And I used to make my living not in the studio because they couldn't pay me. But I learned from Bill Schwartow how to engineer. I was his cleanup boy. And he said, well, if you cut discs, you'll learn how not to put this mic and this compressor on so you don't have a de-essing problem. Well, he taught me more from the time I was 15 through 17 than most people. So he was a real mentor for me. Tom Dowd was a guy like that, Al Schmidt, people that I worked with. I was very fortunate. What I did subsequently in my early 20s was to start courses like this at the University of Rochester, Berkeley, and took a collection of us, and I'd say, look, can you give me 4 days or 5 days of your week, and we're going to do 3 weeks of start to finish, and we got that's how I got to know Steve Gadd and all those guys, because we all went to school together. Many people like myself knew that I was, felt that some of our musical training, and that's why I went to music schools, and said if you could just have a combination, because a lot of people here are going to end up in a stage band, some in a symphony, and some nowhere. And a lot of people have great musical ears, but need some technology training. And I must say that over the years, because I spent my juvenile years of learning, and a lot of people graduated from A&R Studios in New York, but because we taught each other, and there was a discipline amongst ourselves, and some of the finest people in the engineering world and musical world and producers came out of there. What I am in favor of is that across the country there are such things as a place to start. I'm working with an intern right now who has graduated from a school that I spoke at. I took a young man from Berkeley. They stole him. He became the top jingle singer in town instead of becoming the engineer that he thought he was going to become. I've seen a lot of success stories, and for me, as simple as the basics, as putting a good track sheet together, understanding when an artist is temperamental and that they don't need your commentary, but need your empathy and a foot lozenger and something else, only gets taught in the studio. But I really think that there is more technology being taught, because my son is better at the computer than I am, and that just says a lot about where his, at 8 years old, is coming into being about a musician. Where do I send him when he's 17? Should he go to a college and come out 4 years later with the same PhD that someone else has, and he may not go any further, whereas if his training is to be in film and technology and laser discs, maybe that's where he should go. So I'm not against it. I think the prices are a bit high. And I think the other problem with the schools, just for technical reasons, is that when I try to teach, you can't teach 25 people in a room because you don't have 25 consoles. So what you end up doing is working 3-hour spells with everybody, and you go around the clock for 24 hours, and it's not hard, but after 10 days, you don't have anything that you've really helped them with.
I feel that the schools have a place in the community, but maybe the curriculum that they teach needs some.
We need some more hands-on stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, if all the clubs had an ability to not argue about recording the track for them so they'd get that hands-on experience. I mean, there's a very funny story about a guy who said he was an assistant to Hugh, and when I arrived at the session at the townhouse, and we had a live set of drums for a McCartney session, he almost collapsed. He said, well, I worked with Hugh in the control room, you know, and I said, well, graduate up, man. This is a
But you see, I think maybe that's a difference in America to England, is that, you know, I'm a little bit anti the schools, because if I have an assistant working with me, then I'm his school. Like, I get him to do the punch-ins and whatever. Very few assistants, to me, it seems, in America do anything except change the tape when you want the song,
and
different song on, and maybe go and get the tea. You know, and I had an assistant the other day who was like completely freaking out, because I just sort of said nonchalantly to him, okay, you're doing all the punch-ins, and he went, I've never done that before, you know, and he was completely freaked out. Whereas I think assistants that work with me and more in England, I think, do a lot more, and therefore they learn more.
But what do you specifically look for in an assistant engineer, let's say, or somebody at the entry level in the business?
What would I look for?
Yeah.
difficult question to answer. I mean, he can't be too cheeky.
But those are important.
They are very important. Like I said
important.
before, you know, to me, on any session or the making of any album, only half of it is the technical side of it, as far as I'm concerned.
You're absolutely right.
You know, you have to be Mr. We would do well in the diplomatic service. You know?
Yeah.
One of the things that I look for is lack of big egos.
Yeah.
Because I think that gets in the way faster than anything. It first of all keeps the assistant from trying to do something because he might do it wrong. But that's how you learn, by doing things. And I expect the second to come up to me if he has a question about whether it's miking the drums or how I want the tape machine set up or whatever, and ask me those questions rather than thinking to himself, well, gee, I should know this. I should just, shut up. Maybe he won't ask me to put the mic on the acoustic guitar. And then, boy, the session's over. It may be that I pull up the acoustic guitar mic and it sounds like dog meat, and so it's easier for me to just run out there and put it where I want and come back in, and he never saw what I did. He hasn't learned anything. It's taken some extra time because I had to fix it, but I didn't have time to teach what I knew to him so that next time he could do it, and then this just starts snowballing in the wrong direction. I've had assistant engineers who almost fought you when you tried to get them to do something. Well, gee, that's not my job, or I don't know how to do this, or I shouldn't have to do this, or whatever. And the way I came up was, if I'm in the control room working and I walk into the control room after using the little boys' room and I'm going to sit down to do the mix again, and I see a coffee cup that fell out of the trash can, I'll go over and pick it up and put it in the trash can. I don't care whether I am sweeping up the floors a little bit after the session, or mixing, or changing tape, or punching in, or whatever I have to do. It's all part of this family that's building this record. And I want to feel like the assistant engineer is part of that family, and wants to, move himself forward without making you feel like he's being pushed and stuff.
Well, I was just going to say one of the ways I tend to evaluate a good assistant is when he's thinking ahead of you, and you say to him, okay, could you go and get a mic out, because we're going to do an acoustic guitar overdub now. He's already sussed that you're going to do an acoustic guitar overdub, and he's already got the mic out. And that's, I've had a few assistants like that who are great. They just have things ready immediately. They're thinking ahead of you.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. The thing I've found, and this is not going to be a chauvinist remark, but I have a preference to work with women associates, because what's happened is that the women that have come up the line now, who really want to become part of the project, have a tremendous deep interest, and very much like the film industry, are more oriented to the detail and take on a whole other aspect for you. Now, it's a bit of a struggle in some studios, because guys don't like to see or like the language of it to be clean, but you break all of those rules fast. But as you said, no one can do a take sheet. One of the hardest problems for me is keeping forth all of the elements of the record, keeping someone who may be programming hours and hours of work, and it may be tedious. And some of the egos of the new young guys is that I should be in your seat before I graduate. And I have always said, I will shove you into that seat more times than you're going to want, because I'm not afraid to say, punch, do the vocals, set the EQ, let me hear what you're going to do, and I want to see that limiter working, and I want to know, and how much compression. If you do that with people, you teach them, but what I'm getting at is that they don't want to do the dirty work, which is the time spent to do an accurate sheet. All you have to do is one song with a Barbra Streisand where there are maybe 15 to 20 takes, as you well know. And we did it, and when you looked around, you saw this huge sheet that was on, and we had this girl sitting in the back of the room that nobody knew what she did. But her job was that if one of us...
We found out.
Yeah, Barbara would say, I like take 2 of the day of the first take, And we did subsequent takes by numbers, and breath from 18, the intro that I liked what I sang on the second verse, which is really
Michael does the same thing.
you know, the first verse is the second verse, a kind of similar thing. And so you make up a roadmap, and what you do is you leave the room and you say, please do that for me, and do the alternate A, B, C, and D versions of that vocal. Well, you have a real friend if that person is your assistant and is able to take on that load. And when an artist turns around and said, that's not the right line, that's take 63's line.
They can remember.
And they go and they say, I used 63, but I heard you say, and maybe it's my mistake. And no wise guy kind of thing, you know, just saying, I thought it would be better. You know, and I checked with the producer. That is an art form that directors have. They have an assistant director. And people who produce records are going to have a very competent assistant, because there's no room for only one of us to be in the control room anymore.
I look for all the things that it takes to be an engineer: diplomacy, a good ear, music training, technical training, and one other thing: physical strength is very important. Keeping your body in good shape. Because for me, you know, I like to hang in the studio. When we get started on something, it usually involves a pretty long day. You?
I agree pretty well with what you said there, Bruce, really. It's so difficult to answer more specifically than that to me, because every assistant I've ever worked with is quite different in their character. But I think, yeah, I have had assistants who have believed that they're going to be Mr. Big Producer within 9 months and have that attitude, and they're usually out of the door on the first day. Ego, I suppose, isn't it?
Or lack of.
Well, lack of ego is what you're looking for, yeah. No, I can't really add much more to what you said.
Well, I think all of the things you've said, and I really look at attentiveness of the assistant engineer in the studio. If I'm working at a studio where while I'm recording, the assistant engineer is sitting in the back of the room reading a magazine or the newspaper or something, not really paying attention to what's going on, I'm not going to let him do the horn overdub or do any part of the recording, anything where there might be a mistake and lose something that we're trying to get. If I have an assistant engineer who's always on top of it and is trying to think one step ahead, what's Roger going to do next? And I go over to punch in the pan button on a track, and I accidentally hit the wrong button, but he knows that I wanted to punch the pan button. So he'll go, oh, you missed that, you hit the B cut or something, and he'll go over and correct it for me. So that guy's really on top of it, and I'll let him do the next overdub or do this or do that, and I know that he's paying enough attention that when the producer says, I want to go in at the second bar of the first chorus and come out at the fourth bar of the second chorus, right? That he knows enough about what's going on that he's not going to make a mistake. Where if it was the first guy, he'd go, yeah, okay, and then he'd punch in maybe at the fourth bar of the second, you know, make a mistake that's going to potentially erase something that we needed to keep. And so it's just this attentiveness and paying attention to what's going on, right? Sensitivity toward what's going on, and I'll let him do as much as he wants to do, and up to the point where he can do the engineering and I'll be the second would be the best case for taking this guy and moving him ahead.
Phil?
I think you build loyalty with people when people see that you and your assistant are pals and that you are really caring about the way you are treated, because sometimes accidentally management and other people will come into a studio and sort of tear up on the assistant because maybe they didn't like the cassette copy, or, you know, and you don't want them to get defensive. Many times we work in independent recording studios that are owned by owners, and only the information that is given to them when you say, look, this is the third time I've said this S3000 doesn't work or this doesn't work. If your assistant is with you and says, it hasn't been repaired, what do I do? And you stick with them, so when something harsh comes down on them and you show the trust, then the artist believes that you're a team.
Builds
and
confidence.
at 2 in the morning, when you may be real tired and somebody says, can I have a DAT? And by the way, would you make that edit? And you say, yeah, go ahead, make the edit, and also give them an alternate of the third verse, because we didn't do that. And the language between the two of you is one. And that's the prime. And when an artist sees you that, and if you said, you know, that kid is going to work with you next Tuesday because I'm going to be an hour late on the vocals, do you mind? Oh, no, I love working with him. Oh, and he gets my earphones to sound good. Well, that's because you've worked together. And you know, you graduate that person after a year, because if they want to move on, they may be devoted. Most of us have had people work with us for a year or two, but I generally travel so much so I look for one in LA and one in England and one here. And but they do, you've got to push them up, otherwise, and you come back, sometimes I come back to the Hit Factory or the power station, I look in somebody's now mixing, who 2 years ago was literally sweeping.
I'm really encouraged to see engineers of your caliber confirm something that I've always believed, which is there aren't any rules, they're only tools. You guys do things differently, a lot of things differently, but you seem to get the results that you want. Like you may want analog, you may want digital, you may like something different, you may trigger, but you're getting what you want. It's all valid. So the comment I had to make on the recording schools is when I first started, and I'm sure when you first started, there was no digital, there was no MIDI, there were hardly any keyboards, there were a lot of things that you really only had to learn the basics of good microphone technique, getting good levels to tape, making sure the machines are together. And one of the things I find with interns and people coming to my studio is that they're more specialists. There are a lot of engineers that are sort of like, you know, I'm really hip to the MIDI thing. And, you know, they don't know how to mic a drum kit, or they may not know how to do a stereo, you know, vocal track or something like that. And my question is, do you feel that that trend is going to continue? Do you think people are going to be more specialized? Like you have your drum programmer, or a guy comes in with your, you know, I came up and I learned a lot of it, so I know a lot of the different areas. But now with somebody just learning or just coming out of school, they almost have a music appreciation 101 of the recording industry. They really know. They come out of Full Sail and you'll say, how do you work a synclavier? And they'll say, a synclavier can do this and a synclavier can do that, and they can talk the talk, but they can't make it work. Or they, you know, and they're there for a year, they spend a lot of money, you know, and, you know, they're coming from...
It's a very broad knowledge to acquire in a short space of time. But I think the one thing that we have to remember is that there's probably one basic rule in music recording that is infallible, and that is that there are no rules. There's no wrong way to do something. I mean, somebody will say, oh, you can't use an SM57 on that snare drum, or that, yes, you can. It depends on the music and on what we're trying to create with the sound field and how we're trying to communicate. But I really kind of feel sorry for a lot of the young people that when Phil and I started in the business, I literally learned microphone technique with Count Basie and Stan Kenton and Woody Herman. And I am so grateful for those years. I would love to see these schools tie in with some music area or something where the young people in the business could learn something about microphone technique, about recording drums, or a trumpet section, or you know, or whatever, a mariachi band, or anything. But
that's why I think the best place to learn is on the gig.
Yeah, perhaps so. Yeah, you know, that's what I did, and it was wonderful because the bands, the musicians would do anything. I mean, if you told them they had to play from the chandelier and, you know, backwards, they would do it. It's wonderful, but. I think that would be maybe a school like Berkeley or something that is tied in with a music school is a good place to learn, because the music is so much a part of that school.
Also, I had a question about graduating with a degree in recording. Would it be to my disadvantage or to my advantage to give you a resume that says, I've done this much in recording, or to just go to you and say, I've studied music, can I get a job?
Well, you need, now this is my personal feeling. I think that the technical aspect of what we do is just as important as the musical aspect. If I hear a guy say, well, a second engineer or somebody say, well, I know a lot about music, but I didn't bother to learn anything about the technical stuff, I'll just do it. Not a prayer. Not a prayer. Because for me, I hate surprises. And I want to know when I hook up a microphone preamp or set up a mic or something, I want to know exactly what it's doing. I want to have the signal to noise, the best that it can be, and everything. So both aspects, to me, are equally important.
My question was more addressed to Hugh when you said you'd rather not hire somebody who has a degree in recording because you'd rather train them yourself. And is it going to be to my disadvantage when seeking a job to say, I have a degree in recording and this is what I've learned? Would it be better off for me to just come in and look for a starting position as an assistant?
All I was saying is at some studios, I think, in my experience, you would be at a disadvantage. But I don't want you to feel awful that you've spent all your money in the last 3 years at music college. Personally, I would rather not personally have someone from a college. But I would like to have somebody who was bright because, you know, we are using a lot of computers and that sort of thing now, and it is nice to have
that knowledge,
some sort of knowledge. But I think now kids at school learn computer science as a subject at school anyway.
Yeah, I wish they would
generally.
I wish they were learning more about music. Roger, anything to?
I look at the cover letter that comes with the resume probably more than I do the resume itself. It's nice to see what you've done this, you've done this, you've done this, you've done this, but then I read the letter and I want to know what you want to do in the future. And I read a lot into your personality by how well that cover letter is written and how well you're conveying to me your enthusiasm for doing what you want to do. And I think that's really important. And because if you have two resumes from two different guys and they went to the same school and did the same thing, that doesn't make them the same person. But this verbose letter that explains to me what they're looking for in the future tells me a lot about the person, and I've called up guys based on that and had interviews and hired some people. And so I think that's the most important part of that.
Phil?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief, but I think that's 90% of what I read in people's resume is about themselves that I'm interested. I think if you say I've had a large interest in music, I do this, I do that. So much of those are kind of misdirected because I think as you interview somebody, you can tell pretty much by what kind of a fan they are of the music that they love and how they won't sit there if you have to do a country record and close their eyes and say, I'm not doing this. You know, you see it on the paper almost immediately. It comes right off the paper. So don't be frightened because somebody said that maybe a degree will hold you back. It'll never hold you back. I mean, I prefer actually to have somebody who has some kind of technical. I mean, I'm with you as far as I don't want to.
I hate surprises.
Oh, I don't want to have somebody put an AC supply through a 50-ohm mic, thank you.
Right. Well, time is up.
Time for lunch?
Yeah. And I want to thank my three pals here.